The crowd started stampeding toward the exits, but the coach blew his whistle and said, "Nobody goes home until we finish this drill." I was standing in the second row of the home bleachers at Caldwell Regional Sports Complex. No, not that Caldwell, the county facility on Route 9, the one with the cracked parking lot and the concession stand that always ran out of hot chocolate by halftime, when I heard the sound. Where it wasn't the roar of the crowd or the referee's whistle or the thud of cleats on frozen turf. It was something underneath all of that. A deep, resonant groan from somewhere in the structure of the facility, like a ship's hull deciding whether tonight was the night it gave up. The north bleacher section, maybe 60 feet to my left, shuddered visibly. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled through the aluminum seating and up through my boots and into my chest. And then approximately 400 people around me made a collective decision in about 2 seconds flat, the ancient animal decision that doesn't involve logic or deliberation. The decision to move away from the sound, fast, toward light and open air, regardless of what was in the way. The crowd became a single organism. I grabbed the railing and held on, and through the chaos I looked down at the field where my son Theo was standing in his blue number 8 jersey, just staring up at the bleachers with his helmet in his hands, and I watched Coach Remy Stafford blow his whistle so hard the sound cut through everything, and I watched him position himself between my son and the gate, and I watched him say the words that would cost him everything. I need to explain who Remy Stafford was before he became the person who stood on that field on a cold Friday night in November and made the worst decision of his professional life. Because the man I'm describing existed before that decision, and the two versions of him are not entirely reconcilable, and I have spent 2 years trying to understand how one became the other. Stafford had been head coach of the Millhaven Falcons junior varsity football program for 11 years when this happened. He was 44 years old, stocky and broad-faced, with a voice that carried across a field the way voices like that do, naturally, without effort, or as if the air itself got out of the way. He had played linebacker at a Division II school in Ohio, had been an assistant coach at 2 other programs before landing at Millhaven, and had built the JV squad into something legitimately respected in the county. Not a powerhouse, but a disciplined team with a reputation for clean play and for developing kids who understood the game. Parents liked him. The athletic director, a man named Wendell Price, who had been running Millhaven's sports programs for 16 years, described him publicly as one of the most dedicated coaches on staff. I had liked him too. I had stood on these same bleachers for 3 seasons, watching Stafford coach my son, watching him pull Theo aside after bad plays not to berate him, but to explain, watching him make adjustments at halftime that consistently demonstrated he was paying attention to things other coaches missed, and I had trusted him with my kid. That trust is something I think about now, the way you think about a lock on a door you didn't realize was keeping something dangerous out. The first sign that something was wrong with the facility that night had been visible before kickoff, if you knew to look for it. I didn't know to look. I'm not an engineer, and I had no reason to think the building I'd been sitting in for dozens of games over 3 years was anything other than what it appeared to be. Old. De-underfunded, but standing. What I noticed, and told myself was nothing, was that the north bleacher section had a rope across the bottom of its stairs with a handwritten sign that said, "Section closed for maintenance." I noticed it because usually on a Friday night game that section filled up with visiting team families, and its emptiness gave the stadium an off-balance quality. I noticed it and moved on. What I did not know at the time, and would learn in exhaustive detail over the following 6 months, was that the maintenance in question had been ordered 3 weeks prior after a structural inspection conducted by a county facilities engineer named Leonard Kasperzak, who had 16 years of experience with public facility assessments and who had flagged the north bleacher section support columns as showing significant stress fracturing consistent with years of deferred maintenance. His written report, filed on October 18th, he recommended immediate suspension of use for that section pending repairs. His follow-up email, sent 9 days later when no action had been taken, used stronger language. Imminent risk of partial structural failure under load. The repairs were scheduled. The season was nearly over. Someone made a decision to keep the rest of the facility open and rope off the damaged section and get through the remaining 2 home games before the contractor could come in. Almost that someone was never definitively identified in the subsequent investigation, which is its own particular kind of institutional failure, but the paper trail led consistently in the direction of the county facilities director's office. None of this information existed in my mind at 7:22 p.m. on November 8th. What existed in my mind was the game. Millhaven, down by 4, fourth quarter. Theo had been playing well. The cold was starting to get into my knees. Not the groan from the north section happened at 7:26 p.m. I know the exact time because my phone's photo app timestamped the picture I instinctively took of the crowd reaction, a reflex I can't explain, except that I had my phone in my hand and my body did something before my mind caught up. In the photo, you can see the beginning of the movement. Bodies turning, arms raising, the first ripple of the panic wave. The actual structural event was minor. Mike, in the technical sense, one of the flag's support columns shifted, causing a section of the outer bleacher frame to visibly separate from its anchor point. Nothing collapsed. No one in the closed section was hurt because no one was in it. But the sound it made was enormous, and the visual of metal moving when metal is not supposed to move is one of the most primal triggers a human crowd can experience. And what followed was not a slow, orderly evacuation. It was a stampede. People climbed over each other. A woman 2 rows behind me fell and was helped up by a stranger and then fell again. A man in a visiting team jacket lost his child for 30 seconds that I imagined felt like 30 minutes. I held the railing and did not move because moving felt more dangerous than staying still, and I watched the field through the chaos, looking for Theo, and I found him, and that is when I saw Stafford blow the whistle. The players on the field had all stopped. That was the first thing. The game had effectively ended the moment the crowd started moving. The referee had frozen, the visiting team's players had drifted toward their sideline looking at the bleachers, and the Millhaven players had clustered near midfield in the instinctive way of a group that doesn't know whether to run or wait. Theo was among them. He was looking at the bleachers, then at the gate in the end zone fence that led to the parking lot, and he was clearly calculating whether to move. That calculation lasted about 4 seconds before Stafford's whistle cut through everything. Stafford walked to the center of the cluster of Millhaven players, 14 teenagers in full pads, ages 14 to 16, and I watched him hold both arms out to his sides in the universal gesture for stop. He said something I couldn't hear from the bleachers. One of the boys, a tall kid named Marcus, whose name I would hear repeatedly in the weeks that followed. No, wait, I can't use that name. A tall kid named Quinlan, who played tight end, pointed at the gate and said something back. Stafford shook his head. He blew the whistle again. And then, with a certainty that I still cannot entirely explain, I understood that he was not letting them leave. I understood it the way you understand certain things in moments of crisis, suddenly and completely, and without the comfort of hoping you're wrong. I grabbed the railing in front of me and I started moving toward the field. Getting from the second row of the home bleachers to the field gate took me 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and I know this because the timestamps on the texts I was sending to my wife at Aora while I was moving marked the start and end. The crowd was still moving against me, chaotic and dense. People trying to reach exits that were suddenly bottlenecked with the same 400 bodies simultaneously deciding that the nearest door was the right door. I pushed through, not gently, saying excuse me to no one and sorry to everyone, and keeping my eyes on the gate at the end of the bleacher stairs. I had my phone out and I called Theo's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, which meant he either had it off during the game or couldn't hear it over the noise. Which was both standard and infuriating. I called again. Same result. I texted, "Get to the gate now." I don't know if he ever read it during those minutes. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs and pushed through the last knot of people and got to the chain link fence that separated the stands from the field perimeter, I could see the situation clearly for the first time. Stafford had his players arranged in a formation near the 40-yard line. A formation. They were running a drill. The visiting team and its coaching staff had already exited through the far gate. The referee and his crew were gone. The north bleacher section had developed a visible crack in its outer frame that you could see from field level, a dark diagonal line against the aluminum that had not been there at kickoff. And Stafford was blowing the whistle and calling out positions, and my son was moving where Stafford pointed him. I grabbed the fence and yelled Theo's name as loud as I have ever yelled anything in my life. Theo heard me. He turned, and even from 40 yards away, I could see the expression on his face shift from focused, the game-face concentration he'd been wearing all evening, to something confused, as if my presence outside the fence was unexpected information that didn't fit his current instructions. He looked at Stafford. Stafford was not looking at the fence. He was watching the drill. I yelled again, my voice rough and raw in the November cold, and this time I said the words, "Theo, get off the field, now." Stafford heard that one. He turned and looked at me, and the expression on his face was the one I will never forget. Not anger, not alarm, but the specific irritation of a man whose authority has been interrupted by someone he's decided doesn't understand the situation. He held up one hand toward me in the patience gesture, the same gesture you'd give a parent who'd walked onto the sideline during a normal practice. And then he turned back to his players. My son looked at me. He looked at Stafford. He took one step towards Stafford's end of the field, following the drill formation, and something broke open in my chest that was not quite panic and not quite rage, but was made of both. I went over the fence. I have not been a teenager for 24 years, and I am not in the physical condition I was at 20. And the fact that I cleared that fence at all is something my wife still mentions as evidence that adrenaline is not a metaphor. I landed on the field side and kept moving. What happened in the next 8 minutes has been documented in 3 separate investigations, 2 of which I participated in, and 1 of which I was the subject of. Stafford saw me coming across the field and moved to intercept me. And we had a conversation standing approximately 30 feet from my 14-year-old son that I will not reproduce verbatim because some of the language I used was not the language of a man making his best decisions. The core of it was this. I told Stafford that the structure was compromised, that the county had been warned, that the north section was cracking further as we stood there. I could see it happening, and that he needed to get these kids off the field and out of the facility immediately. He told me that there was no confirmed emergency, that panicking crowds were dangerous and unpredictable, that the safest place for his players was where he could see them and account for them, and that he had a duty of care to ensure they didn't get caught in the crowd crush trying to exit. And this was not entirely irrational. I want to say that because what follows is not a story about a monster. It's a story about a man whose logic, in a particular kind of crisis moment, led him somewhere that logic should not have been allowed to lead. The crowd crush argument was real. People had been hurt in the bleacher evacuation. I would learn later that a woman named Frederica Olawale had broken her wrist in the initial stampede, and 2 other people had minor injuries from falls. Stafford had clearly made a calculation that keeping his players on the open field, away from the crowd, was the protective choice. He was wrong, but the logic had a shape, and I think understanding that shape is important, even though it doesn't change what it cost us. The north bleacher section partially collapsed at 7:41 p.m. I know this exact time because the county's emergency dispatch log timestamped the first 911 call at 7:41:08. I was standing on the 40-yard line arguing with Remy Stafford when it happened. The sound was nothing like the movies. Not a dramatic crash, but a sustained metallic screech, almost musical in its wrongness, followed by a concussive thud that I felt in my sternum. The outer frame of the north section dropped approximately 4 feet and then caught on a secondary support that had not yet failed, leaving the structure tilted at a violent angle, hemorrhaging dust and fragments of concrete base. And no one was in the section. No one was hurt by the collapse itself, but the section's failure sent a shockwave of debris and dust toward the field. Chunks of concrete base material, bolts, sections of aluminum seat bracket, and they landed across the field's north end zone in a scattered radius that I can only describe as what it would look like if someone emptied a toolbox from 60 feet up. Several pieces landed within 20 feet of where Stafford's players were standing. One bolt struck a junior player named Benji Achebe in the shoulder pad, hard enough to knock him sideways. His pad absorbed most of it. He had a bruise the size of a fist. It could have been his skull. The gap between those 2 outcomes is exactly what the subsequent investigation spent 6 months measuring. Stafford got his players off the field in 30 seconds flat after the collapse. I will give him that. The argument he and I had been having dissolved the instant debris started landing. And he moved with the efficiency of someone who had coached long enough to move quickly under pressure, pointing players toward the south gate exit in a controlled single file that was faster than it looked. I grabbed Theo by the arm as he passed and kept my hand there until we were through the gate and into the parking lot and past the concrete pillars of the facility's outer wall. The cold air outside felt like something physical and clean. Theo's helmet was still in his hand and his face was pale under the stadium lights that were still blazing over the tilted remains of the north section. He looked at me and said, very quietly, "Dad, I wanted to leave." I said, "I know." He said, "Coach said we had to finish the drill." I said, "I know." We stood there in the parking lot while sirens got closer, and I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small, and neither of us said anything else for a while. The emergency response arrived quickly. I'll say that for the county. 2 fire department units and an EMS crew were on scene within 9 minutes of the first 911 call. Captain Lydia Murchison, a 15-year veteran of the county fire service who would later testify at the county safety board hearing, conducted an immediate assessment of the facility and ordered it fully evacuated and sealed within 20 minutes of arrival. She also documented the debris field on the playing surface with her department's standard incident camera, and that documentation would become, as her department's attorney later described it to me, one of the more compelling pieces of physical evidence in the administrative proceedings. The debris field photographs showed 62 individual pieces of structural material scattered across the north end zone and surrounding field area, with the farthest piece landing 33 feet from where Stafford's players had been standing when the collapse occurred. Captain Murchison told me when I spoke with her 6 weeks later as part of my own preparation for the school board hearing that when she reviewed the timeline, the 7:26 crowd evacuation, the 7:41 collapse, the 15-minute window during which Stafford kept 14 minors on the field, her exact words were, "That's not a coaching decision. That's a liability event." I wrote that down. I still have the notebook. The institutional response to what happened that night moved in 3 parallel tracks that I spent the better part of the next year navigating, often simultaneously, frequently in opposition to each other, in the way that institutional responses tend to work when multiple organizations are trying to protect themselves while appearing to pursue accountability. Track 1 was the school district's internal investigation. Conducted by the district's Human Resources Department under the oversight of Millhaven Superintendent Dr. Ophelia Ibarra, who had been in the position for 8 years and who was, in my experience of her, someone who understood the difference between genuine accountability and its performance, but who operated within constraints that made the former genuinely difficult. Track 2 was the County Safety Board's investigation into the facility's maintenance failures. The decision to continue using a flagged structure and the chain of authority that produced that decision. Track 3 was the civil matter. Our family, along with 4 other families whose children had been on that field, retained an attorney. Her name was Portia Kamani, and she had been practicing personal injury and institutional negligence law for 23 years. And the first thing she said to me in our initial consultation was, "Tell me everything you remember. Why in the order you remember it, and don't minimize anything." I talked for 2 hours. She took 14 pages of handwritten notes. At the end, she closed her legal pad and said, "This is not a complicated case." I asked her what she meant. She said, "The question is never whether negligence occurred. The question is who we're holding responsible for it and in what proportion." She was right. It was not a complicated case. It was a devastatingly clear one, which in my experience is sometimes harder to live through than a complicated one, because clarity doesn't leave you anything to argue against. The school district's internal investigation concluded after 9 weeks. The findings were presented to the school board in a closed session in late January, and then summarized in a public document that I read approximately 15 times in the 2 days after it was released. The document found that Coach Remy Stafford had exercised poor judgment in maintaining players on the field during an active emergency evacuation, and had failed to respond appropriately to clear environmental indicators of structural risk. It recommended the termination of his employment contract. The school board voted 6-1 to accept the recommendation. Stafford was terminated on January 31st. The dissenting vote came from a board member named Gerald Faust, who argued in a public statement that Stafford's record of 11 years of dedicated service warranted a lesser consequence, and that his decision, while wrong, had been made in good faith under high-pressure conditions. I read Gerald Faust's statement several times, too. I disagree with his conclusion. I understand his reasoning. Those two things coexist in me in a way that does not resolve cleanly. At the County Safety Board's investigation took longer, 5 months, and produced a report that named 4 individuals in the facilities department whose decisions had contributed to the dangerous condition of the north bleacher section, and recommended significant changes to the county's facilities inspection and maintenance authorization protocols. 2 of the 4 individuals named were reassigned to different roles. 1 retired during the investigation. 1 contested the findings through the county's appeals process, which was ongoing at the time I'm describing this. The county also settled a separate civil claim brought by Frederica Olawale, the woman who broke her wrist in the initial stampede, for an amount that was not disclosed publicly. Our civil case, representing my family and the 4 others, moved on a timeline that Portia Kamani told us was faster than typical, partly because the documentary evidence was strong, and partly because the county and the school district both had insurance coverage that created an incentive to settle before the case reached discovery, where significantly more uncomfortable information tends to surface. The depositions were conducted over 3 days in March. I was deposed for 4 hours. Theo was deposed, which required special protocols because of his age. And in a session that lasted 90 minutes and which I was not permitted to attend, though Portia was present throughout and briefed me immediately after. She said he was composed and precise, and that his account was consistent with mine in every material detail. She said the opposing attorney's attempt to suggest he might have misunderstood or misremembered Stafford's words, the "nobody goes home until we finish this drill" statement, had not gone well for the opposing side, because Theo had answered the question 3 different ways across 3 different framings, and his answer had not changed once. I was proud of him in a way that I found difficult to sit with, because I did not want my 14-year-old son to have to be composed and precise in a deposition room. That composure was the product of something I would rather he hadn't experienced. Stafford was also deposed. I was not in the room. Portia told me afterward, with her characteristic economy, that he had not helped himself. The settlement was reached in June, 7 months after the incident. The terms are confidential, and I am not going to describe the financial details here, because I signed a document that prohibits it, and because, frankly, the money was never the point, even though it was necessary and just. What I will say is that the settlement involved the school district, the county facilities office, and their respective insurers, and that Portia's assessment of the distribution of responsibility across those entities was, in her words at our final meeting, appropriate. She shook my hand at the end of that meeting and said she hoped we were done needing each other, which is the kindest way an attorney has ever told me not to get into any more trouble. I thanked her and meant it without reservation. I drove home from her office on a warm June afternoon and parked in the driveway and sat in the car for about 10 minutes, not quite ready to go inside and have it be over. 7 months of documentation and depositions and school board hearings and county safety board meetings and reporters calling and other parents texting and Theo processing something he shouldn't have had to process. All of it compressed into an envelope of concluded business. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the aftermath of something, which is different. The distinction matters. Remy Stafford did not contest his termination. His union filed a procedural grievance that was resolved without a hearing. He did not respond to the one attempt I made to contact him 6 weeks after the settlement, when I sent him a letter, not a legal document, just a letter, telling him I understood the impossible position he believed he was in on that field, and that I hoped he was finding his way through the consequences of his choice. I don't know if he read it. I don't know if it would have mattered if he did. What I know is that I needed to send it for my own reasons, the same way I needed to be the person who went over that fence, and the same way I need to tell this story now. Some things have to be completed even when they can't be fixed. Stafford was 44 years old. He had coached for 11 years. He loved the sport and the kids. I believe that fully and without irony. And he made a choice in a crisis that came from a kind of love that didn't know its own limits. That is a human story. Yes, it is also a story about the cost of authority exercised without the humility to say, I don't know enough right now to make this call. The debris field in that end zone, 62 pieces, the farthest landing 33 feet from where my son stood, is the physical answer to the question of what that cost was. We were extraordinarily lucky. That is a fact I carry with the specific weight of things that could have been catastrophically different and weren't. Theo started high school in September. He plays varsity soccer now, not football. His choice, made quietly at the end of the school year with a composure that told me he'd already decided before he brought it up. He said he wanted to try something different. I said that sounded like a good idea. We didn't discuss the other reasons, though I think we both knew them. His new coach is a woman named Petra Volkov, who played collegiate soccer in the 90s and who runs her program with a specific set of protocols that include, I noted at the first practice I attended, a clearly posted emergency evacuation route on the fence at every entrance to the practice field, and a laminated card on her coaching clipboard that she showed me when I asked about it. Incident response procedures, county emergency contacts, the whole structure of what to do when something goes wrong. She saw me looking at it and said, without any particular emphasis, that she'd updated her protocols last fall after reading about an incident at a county sports facility. She didn't look at me when she said it. I didn't confirm or deny anything. We watched the practice in comfortable silence, and Theo scored twice in the scrimmage, and I drove home in the November dark with the heat on and the radio quiet, thinking about the particular mercy of a new season and a new field, and a coach who had read the right report. If you made it this far, I appreciate you being here for it. Hit like if this story stayed with you. It stayed with me.